Hi everyone, it's nice to see you all again. So I'm here today to talk to you about my older adult presentation, and the person I chose to interview was my grandmother, Elsie Sojos. There she is right there. Her birthday is June 25th, 1945. Her place of birth was in Puerto Rico. She moved to the Bronx, New York at the age of 3, and during the time frame of 12 to 18, she was a resident of the Bronx. The stages of development, Erik Erikson's theory is very interesting to me, which is why I decided to choose it. In this theory, he states that an individual will go through 8 stages of life. The stage that I chose to use was the adolescent stage. During this stage, the adolescent is looking to find themselves, looking to find their identity, and they're looking to separate themselves from their parents, separate themselves from their siblings. They want to find themselves and who they are, what their role is in their world. And they will be successful in this if throughout their stages they have been able to overcome conflict. And so now we're going to discuss the important adolescent stages in my grandmother's life. First and foremost, she was very adamant that graduating school was her best accomplishments. So in 1960, ninth grade was actually middle school, which is something that's different from now, whereas now 6th through 7th is middle, or 6th through 8th is middle school. Well, ninth grade was her middle school graduation. And so she said that that day was just amazing for her because she felt like she did something, she finished. During her high school years, she became more independent. She got a job her sophomore year with a stamp collector, working from the hours of 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. During her senior year, she did a work study with the MetLife building, which was an accomplishment all in its own just because it was going from the Bronx to Manhattan, and that was a lot of independence for her. She was able to get out of the little safety zone that her parents had made for her and venture out, and so that gave her more of a sense of self and independence. Later, after her senior year, she graduated high school, which was an extreme accomplishment for her back in that day. She stated to me that she felt like she had did it. She, did what she set out to accomplish. Everyone, all they wanted to do was graduate from high school, and she did that. She also said she was really satisfied in doing that and accomplishing high school and just now being able to get to the next step in her life. So now we're going to talk about the challenges that she faced. My grandmother was very lucky in that she didn't really face any challenges. Both of her parents worked steady jobs. Well, her father did. Her mother raised her. That was her job. And she took care of the home. So she was always with a parent, always had a parent in the environment, and then had a stable 2-family home. And she always lived in the same neighborhood. Her mother, my great-grandmother, still lives in the same neighborhood, in the same building, in the same apartment. So she had a very structured, stable life. Again, her accomplishments were, landing a job, getting a work study at the MetLife building, finishing school, marrying my grandfather, moving out of her parents' home, and then moving into her own home. So in this stage, Erik Erikson talks about the crisis that the social self goes through, the psychosocial self goes through, and it's pretty much identity versus identity confusion or role confusion. And in this stage, the teenager has difficulty knowing what their role is in their world, knowing where they fit in. And in order to figure this out, the adolescent will do different things, try on different roles. And in trying in different roles, the expectation is that the teenager will eventually figure out who they are and what they want out of life. The ease of this stage will rely very much so on the way that the teenager was able to resolve conflict in their childhood and if they were able to do it in a healthy manner. It also is reliant on the way that the parents interact with the child, if they have good communication with them, if they are letting them be who they are, but still guiding them in the right direction. For my grandmother, she was just fortunate. She grew up in the 60s in an era where they just recently had gotten TV. So she didn't have what teenagers nowadays have, the constant social media, the constant in your face, this is what's going on. She grew up in a secluded neighborhood where all she knew was what was around her. So the community, they stood together, they watched over one another. The older adults would parent the younger children and keep watch over them, even if, their parents weren't around. She was also fortunate that New York is a very diverse place, especially in the Bronx. In the 60s, it was different races, different different religious backgrounds, all in one area. And so she was lucky with that. But she was also lucky because she also grew up in an area where her Hispanic heritage was also celebrated. Her age and gender were not an issue for her. Again, she grew up around the same people in a secluded area, and they went to school together, they played together, they went home together. So she was always around the same individuals all the time, which was very important in her life. So I want to discuss the different systems in Elsie's life. First of all, I want to discuss her microsystem. Her tight-knit family, her school, her work, her neighborhood. They all created a mesosystem and they worked together. Her neighbors took care of her. Her family took care of her. They all took care of each other. Her school took care of her. Even her work was close in her neighborhood and it was all a part of the community. Her exosystems, she wasn't not in control of things. I would say the most thing that she wasn't in control of was decisions based off in her home, what her mom and dad decided. And that for her wasn't a problem because it wasn't anything detrimental to her. Her parents stayed together, were married, and didn't have any, significant issues. So she didn't have any significant issues as a child. Her macro system, Elsie was just fortunate. She grew up in an area that was diverse, like I said. She came from Puerto Rico at the age of 3 and was fortunate to keep that heritage going with her. In the Bronx is very high population of Puerto Ricans, especially in the neighborhood where she grew up on, 138th Street and 3rd Avenue. That is very high ratio of Puerto Ricans, but it is also mixed. There are Black Americans, some white Americans. There are also Mexican Americans, I believe, in that neighborhood, and some Middle Eastern Americans as well. So it is a very diverse neighborhood, and they celebrate the different holidays, especially with her Puerto Rican heritage. In the Bronx, they have the Puerto Rican Day Parade. She celebrates Three Kings Day. So these are all things that she kept with her or her family kept with them coming from Puerto Rico. Her chrono system, she didn't really have any significant life changes. Like I said, she lives in the same building. Her mother still lives there. Her parents stayed together throughout her whole teenage life. Her relationships were stable. She married her high school sweetheart. The only thing that really did change was after her adolescent stage, when she finished high school, married her high school sweetheart, and then moved out of her parents' home. I wanted to look at additional theories. And I felt that the fact that my grandmother grew up in the 60s, which was such a social time, now we are a modern social media time. Everything is on the computer, everything is on TV, everything is on your phone. When in the 60s, everything was face to face, one on one. You spoke with a person. You spoke with them on their regular house phone. You wrote letters to them. This was the one-on-one social interaction that my grandmother grew up with. And so, she was able to learn socially. She modeled everything that she saw around in her community. And in her community at that time, it was community camaraderie. Everyone got together. Everyone played on the block. She stated that there would be block parties where they would close off each side of the block and the kids would just play, do different things. They didn't even need toys or, water guns or whatever it is that the kids use nowadays to keep themselves entertained. They just sat around and talked and, had fun. And so that I found was really interesting. And my grandmother was always very self-sufficient. Like I said, from a very early age, her mother instilled in her the independence that she grew up having and made her into such an independent woman that she is today. And so she was very self-sufficient, and this gave her the ability to fend for herself, to accomplish her goals, and to do what she set out to do. Systematic desensitization, she was always determined, and this was without conflict. She didn't need to fight to get her way with her parents. She was more than willing to obey by their rules, even though she may not have liked them. But as she stated numerous times to me throughout this interview, that's what you did back then. You obeyed your parents. You went by their rules, regardless whether you agreed with them or not. I also like the humanistic perspective, focusing on a person's human, view of life and being, and just the perspectives that they get from their experiences and how it teaches them and it grows. My grandmother grew up in a time where she knew she had to get through with school and then she can move out, get married, have kids, and just live the all-American dream. And so that's what she did. She dedicated everything she had to getting out of her house. She got part-time jobs. She even, gave funds to her mother and her father. And then she made it her business to save up money, get an apartment, get married, and then eventually have children. Limitations that Erik Erikson's theory has. I want to say that, yes, Erik Erikson's theory is limited to the modern social context. He doesn't really look into the way that things used to be and the way that the social aspect of the world, let's say in the 60s, was so different from what it is now. So I really feel like his theory is more modern, and it does definitely stick to the way that things are now as far as the way that children are raised. And because of the lack of conflict in her life, I don't feel like my grandmother had an identity crisis. If anything, I feel like her identity was more straightforward. And so this theory is straightforward. It really doesn't seem to have any wiggle room. And I just think that that's a little bit, I wouldn't say wrong, but just, I feel like there has to be more wiggle room. Everybody develops at a different rate. Not everyone is going to have the same social context that my grandmother did and was fortunate enough to have. So I really feel like the theory should address some of those inconsistencies.